hosted by the one, the only, Cam Lau. It is Monday, January 15th, 2024, and you are listening to the 58th episode of this podcast. Thomas Jefferson once said, "We in America do not have a government by the majority. We have a government by the majority who participate." In that spirit, today is the first in the nation Iowa Caucuses, the official start of the race for the White House. Being an Iowan myself, I will be caucusing this evening for Donald Trump, and I encourage any other Iowans to do the same. Don't let the cold weather stop you. I wouldn't put it past the Democrats to have caused this bad weather just to interfere with the Iowa caucus. Seems pretty sus to me. The most recent poll from the Des Moines Register, for Iowa anyway, has Trump at 48%, Nikki Haley at 20%, Ron DeSantis at 16%, and Vivek Ramaswamy at 8%. For those hooligans out there who plan to caucus for Chris Christie, it appears you're out of luck. Christie suspended the Chrisissance on Wednesday, hopefully putting an end to his entire career in politics. That man is just an annoying loser. As for Asa Hutchinson, he's still technically in the race, but you wouldn't know it by looking at any polls. Vivek Ramaswamy's campaign went in the ditch both literally and metaphorically. Not only was he not invited to the latest CNN GOP debate, but his campaign bus actually went into the ditch during some adverse weather that we've been experiencing in Iowa the last week. The debate was just as much of a flop. After the debate for the second-place GOP nomination on Wednesday night, Trump joined Fox News on Thursday for a solo town hall of his own. The event was wildly more successful than the CNN-hosted debate between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. With all the trials and rallies that have been going on, we haven't gotten to see as much of the Donald on national television lately. But on Thursday, he got to show us that he's still on top. He took a variety of questions from Iowans about nearly every issue facing the country. And I gotta say, it's just so refreshing to see him back in the spotlight. So much time has passed since his presidency, I sometimes forget what it was like to have such a strong and competent leader. If all goes well throughout the next year, we'll have him back just in time to prevent World War III and another economic depression. As we do get closer to World War III, on Saturday, thousands of anti-Semites gathered outside the White House to demand that President Biden stop Israel from defending itself against terrorists. Okay, that's not the words that they used, but it's truly what they're asking for. The idea that Israel is somehow the oppressor here is insanity. What happened on October 7th to the Israeli people is comparable to September 11th for Americans. This seems to be a recurring theme for me on this show, but I'm just so frustrated that the terrorist propaganda is actually infecting the minds of so many young Americans. This protest on Saturday actually got out of hand when they began shaking the White House fence, eventually knocking it down partially. People tried climbing the fence, objects were being thrown at officers as they attempted to keep the peace. What I want to know is, at what point do we call that an insurrection? If you ask me, I say we need to round up these folks and lock them up before going after the January 6th people. I mean, after all, January 6th was a protest for election integrity. This protest was a pro-terrorism cause. The crowds also expressed their support for South Africa, because South Africa condemned Israel for what they're now calling a genocide. Somehow war is now genocide. Look, war isn't pretty. There will be civilian casualties. That's a devastating fact. But nobody says anything about Ukraine. I mean, for the rest of the world to look upon Israel and demand that they must play by some kind of rule book is ridiculous. Their enemy doesn't play by these rules, and you can't win a game when you're forced to play by a different set of rules. Meanwhile, the United States has essentially done the exact same actions in the Middle East for nearly half a century, but that's all overlooked. Israelis who actually live on this land, and it's their birthright, are somehow seen as evil oppressors. No, not once, never, ever have the Jews been the oppressors. They've been oppressed since the very beginning, and if you hear any differently, I can almost guarantee that the information is coming from Hamas through some sort of channel. When you think of a terrorist, you like to imagine some grungy-looking brown dudes hiding out in caves with AK-47s, like Al-Qaeda. But the terrorists we're dealing with nowadays are so much further advanced than that. ISIS was basically a full-blown country with vast riches and financial backing. Hamas is an elite organization run by a bunch of oil-rich extremists. Most of these groups are actually not even primarily religiously motivated anymore. It's a big factor, but they're mainly motivated by making money off of all these crimes. The only thing that never changes is that the Middle East is complicated. The Pope's recent decisions have also been complicated. Over the last few weeks, he's allowed for priests to bless same-sex marriages. Immediately after this major decision, church officials went on the damage control, walking back the Pope's statements, saying that he hasn't changed anything and that marriage remains between a man and a woman. This whole thing has left Catholics confused and some diocesan priests to actually begin to distance themselves from the Vatican. Whether the church will remain intact long term is hard to say, but Pope Francis has always been a liberal as far as I could tell, and I know he's been a major concern for many devout Catholics since his beginning of his term. Even more recently, he came down hard against surrogate pregnancy, which seems to be a very Catholic thing to do. My biggest problem with Pope Francis is that he really seems to enjoy a nice Bible buffet, picking and choosing what he likes and leaving on the table what he doesn't have a taste for. I'm not Catholic, so I could say that I really don't care what the Pope decides regarding all these issues. But I do have a lot of Catholic friends, and more importantly, a great number of conservatives are Catholic. If the Vatican continues to push a radical, liberal, and especially unbiblical agenda, it could influence a large population of conservatives who would otherwise have a clear understanding of the debauchery that is homosexuality. Well, that's all I have time for. Were you offended by this podcast? Good. Thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate you all. Have a great week and stay conservative.